Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Brain Coach. I'm your brain coach, Mary Turos, and today we're going to be talking about why tech isn't so great for the lower, middle, high school, and adult brains, and specifically why reading comprehension drops when we read on devices. So, before we dive into all of that, a quick reminder: the information and strategies shared here are grounded in research, but this podcast is for educational purposes only, not medical, not psychological, not therapeutic advice. Coaching is a powerful tool, and it works best alongside, not in place of, licensed professional care when that's needed. All right, so let's get into it. Why tech is not my favorite thing, even though you're probably listening on a device. You are listening on some sort of device. Honestly, why is it so bad? The honest answer is that it's not just one mechanism. It's really about a bunch of different vulnerabilities that stack up depending on which brain you're talking about. So I'm going to start with this is just an overview, by the way. I had a conversation with a business client about why his employees, why his people weren't reading so well. And when we looked at it, they were all reading on devices. So I just started having a conversation at a high level of why that's not a good idea if this is very informed information. And so I thought it might be helpful for the population at large to just, again, have a macro, really, and just an overview. And this is not going to be a deep dive today. But why is it bad for younger kids? And when I talk about younger kids, I'm talking about elementary school or lower school, where the developing brain is really plastic, really malleable, and screens compete directly with the activities that build foundational skills: the free play, the face to face interaction, the unstructured boredom. And there was a systematic review in 2025 that covered ages 0 to 18, and they found that screen time associated really heavily with delays across cognitive, language, and social emotional domains. Not just one area looking at how screen time affects the developmental outcomes in children, but this really accounted for everything across physical, cognitive, emotional, social, everything here. The mechanism here isn't exotic, it's substitution, really. So, time on a tablet is time not spent in the kind of reciprocal interaction that we want, like a caregiver responding to a gesture, a peer negotiating a game, right? And that actually builds language and executive function circuitry. So if you're on a device, it's very passive. Even the ones that are rated as educational, nothing is going to beat real communication with real people and real books. And kids under 2 average about an hour a day on screens right now. I think that's kind of low personally, but it starts to double by preschool, with 5 to 8-year-olds averaging 3.5 hours daily. That to me is shocking. And it's really undermining thinking skills. The research is really showing that under the age of like 8, you should really limit screen time significantly, and under 5, you really shouldn't have any screen time. I know that's gonna rub people the wrong way, but I'm just going by the research, folks. When you hit middle or high school, this is where those effects start to compound, because you've got a brain that's undergoing massive prefrontal cortex remodeling, and it's colliding with hormones, and it's colliding with the social media and smartphone exposure. So if you're starting off as a little kid with screens, it gets worse if you continue with screens. And honestly, screen time, I'm sure you know this, screen time climbs steeply by age. So 11 to 14-year-olds are averaging freaking 9 hours a day, and nearly all teens who are 13 to 17 have a smartphone. It- it- uh, so, there was a big study, a big NIH funded longitudinal neuroimaging study. It found a significant association between screen time and self perceived attention problems and hyperactivity in adolescence. And multimedia multitasking, where you're looking at TV, you have a phone, you might have your computer, you might have your phone, that really hits working memory. It also hits inhibition and task switching ability. And those are the exact executive function muscles you're trying to build. And when you're with this media multitasking, you're going to have a negative effect on those executive function skills, notably that working memory, the inhibition, and the task switching. So layer that on to the reward circuit hijacking from seeing how many likes a post has. These these well-documented, deliberately engineered mechanisms are really hurting us significantly. And then by the time we become emerging adults or regular, full adults, the story starts to shift from developmental derailment to reward system calibration. So a PET imaging study found that now I gotta toss this in. This was a small study, so it's not showing cause and effect, but I thought this was a really interesting study. So a PET imaging study found that a higher proportion of social app usage correlated with lower dopamine synthesis capacity in a certain part of your brain, meaning heavy social media use tracks with a blunted baseline reward system, and that's a pattern similar to those who have ADHD. So separately, the fMRI, where they're doing imaging of your brain in real time, the fMRI on people at high risk for smartphone addiction found significantly lower activation in the frontal polar cortex. And that, if you're like, what the heck is she talking about? That indicates difficulty shifting attention from distracting stimulus towards goal-directed behavior. So you're always working in a mode of distraction. And it's literally the neural signature of people who say they can't focus. And interestingly, this isn't universally bad in adulthood. They did a large cross-sectional study of older adults and found smartphone users showed better cognitive function than non-users, particularly in fluency and abstraction, with no difference in depression, no difference in anxiety. So the dose and use pattern matters enormously, not just the exposure. I know this is getting confusing, but so the through line across the ages, none of this requires addiction framing to matter clinically. It's where you put your attention. It's attention allocation. It's reward calibration and opportunity cost of what you could be doing instead, right? What the developing or the adult brain isn't practicing while it's on a device. That maps pretty directly into the executive function lens you already use. So if you're thinking about sustained attention, working memory, inhibitory control, the exact functions getting the most consistent hits in the literature, which is probably, you know, it's showing up a lot, which is probably why this shows up so often in my clients that I'm seeing. A lot of people will come to me and say, "Oh, I can't seem to focus. I can't get things done." But again, I have to caution this because these are correlational studies. They're cross-sectional design. So the PET dopamine study explicitly was a very small sample. So there's no causation here. So I'm not going to say screen usage causes XYZ, but we want to stay in, you know, dose dependent language here. It it's really useful for how you're framing this for yourself and for your kids or for your loved ones. Now, when it comes to reading, it's true. Reading on a device is not as good as reading a physical book. Now, if you're reading a novel at the beach and you don't really need to retain the information, who cares, right? But if you're reading something where you want to synthesize information or you want to remember information, you want to be able to apply it, it really takes a hit. So school, academic wise, professional wise, it's really not a good idea to read on the screen. And it's actually, there's a term for it now. It's called screen inferiority effect. And it's really one of those more replicated findings in reading research. This is I used to say we don't really know why. We're starting to know why this is. And right now, since 2018, there are 7 huge meta-analysis that have found we comprehend on screens less well than paper. And then another 2024 meta-analysis of 49 studies found that students who read on paper consistently scored higher on comprehension tests than those reading identical materials on screens. And I know a lot of schools have moved to screens, and it really makes me upset. Now, why is this? It's thought that there's shallower processing. And a leading theory is that screen reading encourages a shallow mode of processing. The speed and information density of digital environments really encourage skimming and scanning habits rather than the slower, linear engagement that paper invites. So I've seen this with my clients when I do eye tracking, and the eye tracking work really backs this up directly. Students tend to skim more and reread less efficiently when they're reading on a screen. Their eyes are moving, move, move, move. And the comprehension gap showed up even though students themselves weren't aware that their reading behavior had even changed. That's huge. I've seen this for years. Seen this for years. So, the more times your eyes are moving, it seems like the more you're losing your focus. You're not able to really get the gist of what you're reading. Now, there's also something called disrupted spatial memory, and scrolling appears to be more disruptive to memory than simply turning a physical page. You're losing that tactile spatial landmark. Normally on a screen, they try to mimic this, right? But your brain normally uses these spatial landmarks as retrieval cues. And that's a real cognitive mapping cost, not just a preference thing. So, when you're turning the page, spatial landmarks where, you're usually doing it at the top of the page, right? And you're 3 chapters in or whatever. Reading on a device is also, so it's a dose and task dependent. It's not absolute. And this is the part worth thinking about. The effect is slight and relatively consistent, particularly for long expository reading assignments, like these texts under time constraints. But it's really unresolved because it really depends on the age, the task, the text type, individual differences. Again, if you're reading a novel leisurely on a Kindle, that's not the same as reading a textbook chapter, or skimming on a laptop before a quiz. So, downstream in kids specifically, an MRI study found that children who spend more time reading physical books show stronger brain connections in areas related to language and cognitive control, while heavier screen time kids show fewer of those connections. And children with access to print books complete an average of 3 additional years of education than those without. Okay, that's a correlation, but that is not found in ebooks. Again, I can't say it's causation, the ebooks versus real books. It's not nailed down yet, but it just seems to be going that way. So the bottom line is the deficit isn't that digital text is inherently unreadable. It's that screens invite skimming, they remove the spatial memory cues, and when you're on a laptop or a phone, you sit one tap away from every distraction on that device. And so for anything that requires deep comprehension or retention, especially with executive function, vulnerable people, kids, the paper is best. Paper has a real edge to learning and remembering. Something I'm seeing, and this is quite anecdotal, the kids that I encounter don't want to do an e-reader. They hate the Kindles and the iPads. They want real books. So, there's a reason certain bookstores are coming back into the mainstream. and this makes me very happy. So anyway, that's it for today. You can find me at braincogcoach.com where my updated course and workbook will be launching soon. Until next time, take care of your brain.